Chapter 2. No Rest for the Damned. Adrian lay on his cot, the cold stone of the sill pressing into his back through the thin fabric. His eyes were closed, but he wasn't asleep. The dull ache of his wounds pulsed with each heartbeat. Though it was nothing new, pain had become a constant companion, whispering in the silence, reminding him of the life he had lost. His thoughts drifted, wandering through the haze of his own memory. His town, the small village where he had been raised by farmers after his mother died in childbirth. He remembered the smell of fresh earth, the soft rustle of crops in the wind, and the laughter of neighbors. A simpler time, before the Templar order had come. The Templars. His jaw clenched as the memory sharpened, images of the order flooding into the village like a plague, their white and crimson armor gleaming in the sun as they declared their righteous authority over all. They had torn through the town like a storm, and then the death of his... The memory shattered. A sharp knock at the door snapped Adrian back to the present. His eyes opened, blinking away the thoughts of the past. He didn't realize people could knock in a place like this. Most of the time the guards simply barged in, uncaring about his state of mind or body. He sat up slowly, wincing as his wounds screamed in protest. His muscles were tight, his body battered, as his leg still throbbed where the gladiator's sword had sliced through his calf. The door swung open. 2 guards entered, their faces as impassive as ever. "You have another fight in 1 hour," one of them grunted, his voice devoid of sympathy. Adrian blinked, his mind still clouded from exhaustion. "How?" he croaked, his voice rough from disuse. The guards exchanged glances before one of them pulled up a small leather pouch from his belt. From inside he drew 2 vials of shimmering red liquid. Healing potions. The glass glinted in the dim light of the cell, the crimson liquid swirling like molten metal. "Someone paid for your recovery," the guard said, holding out the potions. Adrian stared at the vials, his thoughts racing. Healing potions weren't cheap. Or someone wanted to invest in his recovery. They wanted something more from him than just his survival. His lips twisted into a bitter frown. "Do I have the option of saying no?" he asked, with dry sarcasm. The guards didn't laugh. One of them shrugged, the weight of their armor clinking as he leaned against the wall. "The Crown Prince personally wants to see this next fight. The organization is pleased with your performance in the arena. You should be glad you won't have to deal with the recovery time." Adrian gritted his teeth. Recovery time was the only time he had to himself. The only time when his body was too broken to be forced into the arena. Those precious hours filled with nothing but pain and silence were the closest thing to freedom he had left. He cursed the gods under his breath, his mind flashing with hatred for the twisted world he lived in. The guard shoved the vials into his hands, the cold glass pressing against his skin. They waited, standing like stone sentinels, their eyes locked on him as if to ensure he complied. There was no room for refusal. Adrian uncorked the first vial, the scent of magic, thick and metallic in the air. He brought the vial to his lips and drank. The potion burned as it slid down his throat, the magic igniting like a fire in his chest. He felt it immediately, the warmth spreading through his body, tingling his veins. His wounds began to knit together, the torn flesh mending itself with unnatural speed. The pain, once an ever-present hum, began to fade as the magic worked its way through his limbs. He drank the second potion more quickly, already feeling the strength returning to his muscles. The deep cut on his calf healed itself. The bruises on his ribs melted away, and the sharp ache in his arm dulled to a faint pressure. But the healing came with a cost. The fire inside him raged, leaving him on edge, his nerves raw from the forced recovery. The guards watched him with disinterest, waiting until he had drained the last drop. "Good," one of them muttered. "Get ready, he'll be called soon." Adrian let the empty vial fall to the floor with a clatter, his hands trembling with the lingering heat of the potion. He leaned back against the wall, his breathing steady. The wounds may have healed, but something deeper inside him still felt broken. The guards left without another word, the heavy door slamming shut behind them. Adrian closed his eyes again, trying to block out the reality of what lay ahead. The Crown Prince wanted to see him fight. The Crown Prince, Adrian cursed silently, bitterness curling in his gut. He had seen enough nobles in the stand, lounging in their wealth and power, treating gladiators like toys for their amusement. The thought of being part of their entertainment, of fighting for their approval, sickened him. Still feeling the faint heat of the healing potions burning through his veins. The pain had faded, but his mood hadn't improved. He cursed the gods again under his breath, his thoughts heavy with bitterness. The cell felt smaller than usual, its walls closing in on him. Maybe food would help. It wasn't often they let him leave his cell, and even less often that he wasn't met with glares of other gladiators. After all, when you've been brought back from the dead, people tend to hold grudges. The memory of those dead weren't his alone. They belonged to the men he had killed too. The ones who had fallen under his sword, only to be resurrected by twisted magic. They would remember every detail, every stab, every slash. They'd feel the cold steel that had taken their lives, and they'd hate him for it. He dragged himself to his feet, his legs stiff from the forced recovery, and left his cell. The air in the hallway was stale, heavy with the scent of sweat and old blood. Adrian moved with purpose, his steps quick as he headed towards the feast hall. As much as he hated the stairs, the food might be the only good thing about the day. The noise hit him first, clattering utensils, muffled conversations, the dull thrum of life in the pit. The feast hall was dimly lit, torches flickering on the stone walls. The gladiators inside were scattered, and some in small groups, others keeping to themselves. Adrian could feel the weight of their eyes on him as soon as he entered. He ignored them, making his way towards the long tables lined with trays of food. Today's offering was better than usual. A potato, cut into fourths, stacked with pork and cheese. It wasn't a feast fit for kings, but in the pit, it might as well have been. Adrian picked up his tray, eyeing his options for drink. Dirty water or ale? Most gladiators opted for the ale. It was safer than the water anyway. Adrian shrugged to himself, deciding the ale would do just fine. After a day like this, it couldn't hurt. He grabbed a mug and made his way to a bench, his ears still ringing from the clamor of the hall. He felt the stares, the silent judgment from those who had resented him, but he tried to shut it out. He focused on his food, the taste of the cheese and the pork dulling the edge of his frustration. The table creaked as he sat down, the familiar sound of wood straining under the weight of years of men who had eaten their last meals here. Adrian stabbed at the potato with his fork, chewing slowly, trying to lose himself with the simplicity of the moment. Just eat. Don't think. Don't feel. Focused, determined. The way you fight. Bloody, like a lion set loose in the crowd. The voice came from behind him, smooth and unfamiliar. Adrian's hand froze mid-bite, his eyes narrowing as he looked up. Standing across from him was the elf. Not the orchid-haired one from earlier, but the chiseled elf, the one with jewelry and a predatory smile. His black hair gleamed under the dim light. His eyes were locked onto Adrian with an unsettling intensity. Adrian blinked, the fork falling from his hand. His mouth hung open, and he stammered, his brain scrambling to make sense of the moment. "You're that noble." The elf smiled, though it didn't reach his eyes. He leaned forward, resting a hand casually on the table. "Do you consider yourself a lion?" Adrian blinked again, his confusion deepening. "I'd have to be one," the elf continued, his voice cool and contemplative. "I look at myself and see an eel. Adrian's face twisted in bewilderment. An eel? He had no idea what the elf was talking about, but he was way too puzzled to look away. The elf nodded, as if he said something profound. In some elven cultures, eels are said to become imperial dragons. They choose new mages, guide the fates of people, and here you are, fighting, bleeding, like a lion in the pit. Tell me, do you think you could be picked for something greater? Adrian stared at the elf, his mind struggling to keep up with the cryptic words. He had no patience for riddles, especially not from some stranger who appeared out of nowhere to analyze him over a meal. After a few seconds, Adrian's bewilderment gave way to a frustration. He pushed himself up from the bench, his chair scraping against the stone floor. What the fuck are you talking about? His voice was harsh, cutting through the noise of the hall. Who the hell are you? The elf's smile widened, the amusement flickering in his eyes. I am Fensandoral, he said smoothly, his voice dripping with self-assurance. I come from the northern road. Adrian scowled, his confusion deepening. What do you want with me? Fensandoral tilted his head slightly, his gaze never leaving Adrian's. I wish to buy your debt. Adrian's breath caught in his throat. His debt? The chains that bound him to the pit? To the endless cycles of battles? His fist clenched at his sides as he stared at Fensandoral, trying to gauge the elf's intentions. Why? Adrian asked, his voice low. Fensandoral's eyes gleamed, a smile tugging at his lips. Because I see a lion, he said softly, and I have use for one. Adrian stared at Fensandoral, baffled. He scoffed, the sound bitter and sharp in his throat. One master to another? You think I'm some kind of joke? His voice dripped with contempt, the notion of being traded like a commodity sparking something raw and angry deep within him. Fensandoral didn't flinch. In fact, the elf's smile only softened, becoming almost warm. Not at all, he replied, his tone calm and unshaken. You wouldn't be a slave, Adrian. You'd work it off in exchange for a singular task. One job. Adrian's eyes narrowed, suspicious of the elf's soothing voice. But Fensandoral wasn't finished. He leaned in slightly, as if to confide in him. The arena, Fensandoral said softly. It kills more than the body. It kills the mind, the soul. All that blood, all that pain. It strips away your humanity, little by little, until there's nothing left of the person you once were. Just a shell. A machine for killing. Is that what you want? Adrian's hands clenched at his side, his nails biting into his palms. The elf's words dug under his skin, needling at thoughts he hadn't wanted to face. The truth of them was too close to what Adrian feared, too close to the empty void he had been feeling for years. But he would never let Fensandoral see that. His lip curled in disgust, and he raised his voice, interrupting the elf's monologue. My humanity is not of your concern, Adrian spat, a sneer curling his lips as he gave Fensandoral the same mocking smile the elf had offered him moments before. The words felt hollow, but he didn't care. He was about to stand there and be lectured by a man who had likely never bled a day in his life. Adrian pushed himself to his feet, the bench creaking under him as he turned to leave. Fensandoral, still smiling, leaned back in his seat, utterly unbothered by Adrian's outburst. Perhaps you will change your mind one day, child, he called after him, his voice smooth and infuriatingly calm. Adrian's fist clenched as he walked away, his blood boiling. Child? Who was this elf to speak to him like that? He barely knew the man. Yet something about him crawled under Adrian's skin, unsettling and infuriating. That's what he thought. His steps quickened as his breath sharp as the anger pulsed through him. He didn't know what Fensandoral wanted, but the smug certainty in the elf's words gnawed at him. The suggestion that he might be one day submitted to this deal was infuriating as well. Adrian wasn't some pawn to be moved to one master to another, and he sure as hell wasn't going to let some noble elf look down on him like that. Without thinking, Adrian slammed the rest of his tray of half-eaten food into a nearby table, the contents scattering across the floor. The dishes clattering drew stares, but he didn't care. He stormed out of the hall, frustration bubbling inside of him, his head filled with cryptic words of Fensandoral. His footsteps echoed in the narrow stone corridor as he made his way back to the cell block. The promise of another fight loomed ahead, and Adrian could feel the familiar tension building in his chest. Inside his cell, he began pacing back and forth, his boots grinding into the stone floor as his mind raced. He had been prepared for another grueling battle, but now his thoughts were clouded with confusion and frustration. Who was this elf, really? What did he want? The calming, knowing smile, the strange talk of lions and eels. It all felt like part of some game that Adrian didn't understand. His muscles tense as he paced, his body aching for release, for action. The only thing that made sense right now was the arena, the blood in the sand, the battle. He needed to fight, to burn off this anger before it consumed him, and yet, no matter how hard he tried to push it aside, Fensandoral's words echoed in his mind, refusing to leave him in peace. The tension in his muscles were unbearable, his mind racing with fragments of anger and confusion. He replayed Fensandoral's cryptic words over and over, trying to make sense of them. But they only left him more frustrated. Fists clenched and unclenched, the urge to fight building within him like a storm ready to break. The clank of metal boots against the stone corridor pulled him from his thoughts. The guards had arrived. "You're up," one of them grunted. Adrian shot them a sharp look before nodding and following, his mind already shifting into the focused determination he needed for the arena. He wasn't just fighting for his life today. He was fighting to prove something, to show anyone watching, be it the smug crown prince, Fensandoral, or the entire damned arena, that he wasn't just some pawn, some creature to be manipulated. Let them all watch. He'd show them what he was truly made of. The guards led him down the familiar pathway towards the gate. The sound of the crown was already vibrating through the walls, the bloodthirsty chants of the spectators rising like a distant storm. Adrian's pulse quickened as he reached the weapons rack. This time he grabbed 2 short swords. He was done with defense today. It would be all attack. 2 blades, ready to carve through whatever they threw at him. He stepped up to the gate. He rolled his shoulders, feeling the weight of his swords in his hands. His grips tightened. The crown prince could watch as much as he wanted. Adrian was going to give them a show they wouldn't forget. The portcullis began to rise with its usual grinding creak, revealing the harsh light of the arena beyond. Adrian stepped into the sand, his boots sinking slightly into the familiar ground. He felt the heat of the sun on his face as he heard the deafening roar of the crowd. They wanted blood, and they would get it. Across from him, about 20 feet away, stood his opponent. The man was wrapped in cloths and leathers, his face partially obscured by the dark fabric. His posture was relaxed, almost casual. At his side hung a single longsword in a worn scabbard. Adrian's eyes narrowed as he sized him up. Great, Adrian thought, a bitter twist forming his gut. I'm going to be outranged. The longsword would easily give the man more reach, but at least Adrian had a secondary weapon. His twin short swords glinted in the sunlight, ready to slice through any gaps in the man's defenses. They stood in silence for a moment, the crowd's anticipation growing with every second. The distance between them felt like a chasm, but Adrian's muscles were coiled, ready to close the gap in an instant. Then, a bell rang. The sound was sharp and metallic, echoing through the arena. The man unsheathed his sword, the blade catching the light in a flash of brilliant purple metal. Adrian's eyes widened, his breath catching just for a moment. Adamantine. Fuck. The sword gleamed in his eyes. Its purple sheen was unmistakable, unbreakable, ridiculously heavy. And the man was swinging it around, casually, as if it were weightless. Adrian's jaw tightened. This wasn't just a fight anymore. This was going to be a test of everything he had. The man finally spoke, his voice monotone and calm, as if almost he was bored. Are you, Adrian, the Crimson Gladiator? The words hung in the air for a moment. Adrian studied them, his eyes narrowing as he caught a glimpse of the man's tired eyes beneath the wraps. They were familiar, faintly pink in color, with a wariness that seemed out of place in the arena. Yes, Adrian replied, his voice firm. The man gave a slow nod, his face obscured but his eyes never leaving Adrian's. Good. I expect the best from you. There was no malice in his tone, no threat behind his words. He wasn't even here to taunt or intimidate Adrian, which made it all more unsettling. The man lowered his sword, resting the tip into the sand, as if inviting Adrian to make the first move. Adrian's mind raced. This wasn't what he had expected. The man wasn't trying to dominate him with sheer power of the adamantine sword. He was watching, waiting, expecting. The crowd grew restless, the air thick with anticipation as the arena fell silent, waiting for the fight to begin in earnest. He gritted his teeth, adjusting his stance. I'll give him my best, he thought, adrenaline surging through his veins as his grip tightened on the twin short swords. But he won't like what he sees.